everyone. Thanks so much for giving up your time for being here today. Sustainability, we've heard it all before, right? Everyone in IT recently has been up and they've gone, let's look at ways to be sustainable. Let's look at sustainable IT, look at all the carbon emissions we're offsetting, look at all the initiatives we're doing to make things better, right? So you'd be forgiven to sit there and think, oh, just another guy talking to me about how I need to improve things to be more sustainable and how IT can play a part in it. But I don't want to be doom and gloomy. In fact, I promised that there would be no fear-mongering today. There will be a few graphs. I'm a bit of a graph nerd, maybe a little bit of rambling. But hopefully I can turn some of you into optimists, because there's a lot of pessimism when it comes to sustainable IT. There's a lot of people saying, what can I do? There's a lot of people saying, what impact am I going to make? So hopefully I can convey some of that today. Last year I was at Microsoft Ignite. Who's heard this phrase, do more with less, this year? Yeah, been done to death, right? Do more with less. Do more with less when it comes to your IT spend. Do more with less when it comes to your employees. Do more with less when it comes to your servers. I was having a chat with someone that worked with Microsoft, and I said, look, this do more with less thing could just be replaced with stop wasting stuff, right? Stop wasting stuff. We live in a world where uncertain financial times and uncertain climate times for the world, mean that the worst thing that you could possibly have is waste, right? When you're not certain about things going forward and you're not certain about what the future looks like, imagine turning around and saying, well, we just wasted a load of stuff. We just wasted a load of money. We just wasted a load of resources. We just wasted a load of carbon, right? That is terrible when it comes to this. And that leads to things like this. I said no fear-mongering, and I'm only showing this graph because I absolutely hate this graph. This graph makes me look at it and it makes me feel so out of control. It reminds me of when I was a kid. I had a really untidy bedroom. My mum would go tidy your bedroom, Chris, and I'd go, no, it's too untidy. She'd go, oh, no, next week, go tidy your bedroom, and it would be more untidy, and it would be more untidy, and then she would spend an hour tidying your bedroom. I'd go, what am I going to achieve in this hour? It's out of control. It's nothing I can do about this, right? This makes me a pessimist. Makes me think, how do you reverse that? So let's have a look at something else. Let's have a look at a more reasonable graph. If we look at current policies, if we look at current pledges and targets, you know, we're not really seeing a difference until 2090, 2100. And I can't guarantee many things in life, but I'm not going to be here in 2100, pretty sure. And probably a lot of these people in this room aren't going to be here either. I hate to break it to you. So wouldn't it be nice to see something in our lifetime, right? Wouldn't it be nice to actually see some changes in our lifetime? Wouldn't it be nice to be optimistic about net zero and see that temperature change come down consistently? You know, maybe we can look to 2050, 2060 before we drop nearer to that 0 degrees or that 1.6 degrees consistent that we need to look at. I certainly want to be optimistic, and maybe I can convince some of you to be optimistic as well. Here's a challenge. Hands up who's heard of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? Yeah. Okay. That's more people than last year. Last year when I asked who's heard of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, everyone looked at me like I was speaking a different language. Sustainability reporting is broken down into these 3 categories. Emissions caused by your offices and premises, emissions caused by delivering your services, and then indirect emissions caused by your customers and your supply chain. Now, I'm going to use Microsoft as an example because I'm one of the cloud solutions architects and I deal with Microsoft day in, day out. When it comes to Microsoft, everyone's seen the pledges around how their data centers are going to be fully powered by, you know, sustainable energy and things like that, right? They've all seen our data centers will be fully green. Look at us, we're putting a data center in space under the sea to make cooling a lot cheaper and to reduce our carbon impact. But if I was to ask you whether you think that's the largest portion of Microsoft's emissions, most people would say, yeah, of course it is. You know, these data centers, they're using a lot of electricity. They're using electricity around the clock. But actually, if I told you that Microsoft's emissions from their data centers were their scope 2 emissions, which is this tiny sliver here, right, you'd realize that Microsoft have a bigger problem than just offsetting their emissions from their data centers. Their emissions from their supply chain, their emissions from their user base downstream absolutely dwarf the emissions from their offices and their data centers. And I'd be surprised if you broke some of this stuff down a lot of organizations who are here today, your emissions impact isn't too vastly different from that. So, Microsoft have a plan. It's good news. If you look at their plan to 2030, we can see that they plan on reducing their supply chain emissions. It's this lighter blue one here. That orange one there is the emissions from operations, so data centers, offices, and things like that. But really, what they've bet their bottom dollar on is this carbon removal here to cover the positive in their supply chain emissions. So they want to get to carbon negative by 2030. So they've said, look, our scope 3 emissions there of our supply chain, we need to sort of counteract those somehow. Why don't we invest in carbon capture and removal to make sure that, that's offset. How they plan on doing it? This is in Iceland. It's a carbon capture and removal facility. This can capture about 400,000 tons of CO2 globally. It's called ClimateWorks. They've invested about $1 billion in it. They've signed a 10-year lease on the agreement there. But again, there's another small problem in the fact that it can only reduce around 400,000 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere at a rate of $1,250 per ton. Now, at a rate of $1,250, Microsoft have a problem. Because let's say they reduce their supply chain carbon emissions by half, they're still looking at buying nearly 14 million tons of CO2 removal from ClimateWorks. Anyone want to guess how much that costs? Anyone really good at maths? Better than me? No? About 9 billion. Are you going to be the one that goes into Satya Nadella's office and says, you've got to pay a £9 billion cost for emissions that aren't even yours, for emissions that come from your supply chain, for emissions that come from your user base, for emissions that you had no direct control over, right? Can you imagine going to someone and saying, I want $9 billion for something that you've not caused, right? It's going to be a tough one to sell. And here's the problem. As a company grows and gets bigger, if it wants to grow, it's almost impossible in every scenario to reduce your scope 3 emissions. Unless you're, I don't know, the wind. You're not going to be able to reduce your scope 3 emissions. People are going to be using your services. People are going to be downstream. People are going to be upstream. It's virtually impossible to reduce your scope 3 emissions whilst growing, right? It's going to be more in your supply chain. You're going to be buying more. You're going to be purchasing more. You're going to be delivering more. So how do you look to at least mitigate that? Well, look, carbon capture will get cheaper. It's going to become a strategy for a lot of people. I know we're not here today to talk about carbon capture and ways of doing it. You might be in procurement. You might be a sustainability officer. These kind of things might interest you as part of your strategy. But fundamentally, it's an ITSM Summit. We're not really here to talk about this. But, what we're expecting is that this will scale up quite quickly. This can capture up to 1 million tons of CO2 per year, which is about 1/36,000th of the global carbon emissions that we currently emit. So if we build 36,000 of these, then we might have a chance. But, you can only hope that the cost of carbon capture and removal will come down quite significantly as these kind of projects are scaled up. But funny story is, I was reading an article the other day that said that the Joe Biden administration is seriously considering putting more aerosols into the air to reflect the sunlight off the sea to cool down the temperature. Yeah, no, I had the same response, and someone in the Teams chat said, this is how we all die. But no fear-mongering. This will come down, right? And you're sat here thinking, what can I do? You can't afford to build a carbon capture and storage plant in Iceland, probably. You probably can't afford the $9 billion, or even Microsoft can't afford the $9 billion bill for reducing their emissions. So what can you reasonably do to be able to bring down your scope 3 emissions, right? Don't forget, your scope 3 emissions are your supply chain. They're the people that you're purchasing from. But also you want to look at your scope 1 and 2 emissions. Who has a strategy around offsetting, buying RECs, buying renewables and things like that in the room? Do you know that if your company have they tried to get to carbon neutral, carbon net zero, anything like that? Yeah, lot of nodding heads. You'll notice that this is the last step that I've put here, and I'll explain why. Any companies here tried to evaluate their true carbon footprint? Yeah, a few people. It's tough, right? Really, really, really flipping hard to do. You know, there's a lot of benchmarks in the industry. Oh, the average XYZ company uses this many grams of CO2 per server. The average, that software does this, and it's really hard to figure out, does that actually mean anything for me? What have I actually done? And to actually build the reporting capability for your own carbon footprint is really difficult. But it's worth doing, because imagine you're purchasing from someone, right? And imagine that person is going to form part of your Scope 3 emissions, and that person turns around and says, look at all these great reports, look at all these great carbon accounting practices that we've done to be able to deliver our services to you. You can factor that in really easily to your Scope 3 emissions, and you don't need to then scratch your head figuring out building a reporting capability for someone else's problem. Right, so evaluate your true carbon footprint. There's a couple of ways that you could do that. It starts with not greenwashing, right? Don't greenwash it. Don't make yourself feel good. Don't try and do these carbon accountancy practices that just sort of say, right, okay, we don't actually like that data, so let's not include that in our ESG report. A lot of people do that. We speak to a lot of copywriters who say, look, we surface this information to the business, and they say, oh, no, we don't want to talk about that. We can't publish that. Let's make that look a bit different. It's not the point. Don't take industry benchmarks, as I just said, and look for things like embodied carbon, right? How much carbon it actually takes to ship your things about, how much carbon it takes to manufacture servers, how much carbon is embodied within the laptops that you might be purchasing. Are you buying a sustainable laptop, or are you buying an unsustainable laptop? And there's probably some talks today on some of that kind of stuff. But next is the green procurement thing that I just spoke about, right? Look to purchase from people who don't just say they're going to do something. Look to purchase from people who have done something. Look to purchase from people who have brought their targets forward. Look for purchasing from optimistic organizations about the climate, and not just people doing it because they have to do it. Look for people who have carbon accounting built into their organization, so you can factor that in to your Scope 3 emissions. Because if you can figure out what product you're purchasing from them and what its carbon impact is, it's really easy to build that into your own carbon accountancy practice. Next is energy efficient IT infrastructure. I heard a phenomenal stat the other day, phenomenal. And it's in the data center world, 66% of the power goes to powering 7% of the workloads. 66% of the power of a whole data center going to power 7% of the workloads within that data center. Probably some big chunky thing just grinding away at the power, right? Legacy application running on old systems, right? And you might think, well, that's actually costing us in technical debt, it's costing us in innovation, but it's costing you a fortune in electricity to only do 7% of the workload. That just doesn't seem efficient to me. Look for other things as well. You know, there's loads of sustainable IT policies and initiatives out there. Wi-Fi routers that turn themselves off overnight. Who needs Wi-Fi in the office when there's no one there? You know, smart buildings. A lot of people are looking at smart energy infrastructure within their buildings. They're looking at, you know, how can they automate their blinds so the sun doesn't come in and heat up the rooms, but how can they tie that into their aircon systems, right? How can they, you know, turn it up when someone's going to need a room that's a little bit warmer, close it down, but not, you know, how many times have we got it? You go into a meeting room, you go, oh, it's flipping boiling in here. Turn it right down, get into a meeting room. 10 minutes later, everyone's freezing themselves off, and you need to turn it back up again, or you need to open the blinds and let some air in. And you just sat there in a constant cycle of turning the meeting room heat up and down. It happens all the time, right? Look to solve that problem, because that problem's costing you. Next, we get to optimization. And this is the waste piece. Don't buy what you don't need. Even in the cloud world, right? We see people say, oh, we're going to go to the cloud because it's scalable. We're going to go to the cloud because we turn things on and off all the time. We're going to go to the cloud so, you know, we can have these development environments that we can just switch off overnight, and it's not going to cost us anything. And in reality, what we see is people just don't do that. They go to the cloud and they just leave it on, right? Which just completely negates the benefit of doing it in the first place. So there's going to be a lot of talks today about optimization. There's going to be a lot of talks today about saving money. But fundamentally, there's a lot to be said. A lot of people don't even know where these problems exist, right? A lot of people don't even know where they're wasting money. And as we go back to the beginning, the worst thing you can do when it comes to sustainability is waste. For me, it doesn't make any sense to start with offsetting, because hopefully by the time you've taken these 4 steps, you've reduced your carbon emissions impact so much that the amount that you're offsetting becomes minimal. Why would you offset everything when you could trim it down first and then just offset that? That's when you start getting to renewable energy. And don't forget, offsetting doesn't really solve the biggest problem, which is, let's say you've got a data center, that data center is still going to be powered, might still need power at night, it might still need power when the wind's not blowing, might still need power when there's no tidal energy, right? How does it do that? Once the energy's in the grid, it's just in the grid. The data center doesn't care whether it's come from the wind or the sun or the sea, it's just there. So your data center will still be using energy, your office will still be using energy. So, I've given some steps. Let's have a look at why. You're eventually going to have to measure scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, right? You might not have to do it at the moment, but you eventually will. It's coming pretty much, and that's why a lot of organizations have started doing it. So maybe look to build that practice to actually at least start carbon accounting within your organization. Again, given that, the worst thing you could do is waste money, and you've got a lot of direct control over some of your emissions, right? Your scope 1 and 2 emissions, you've got a lot of direct control about that. So when you're purchasing IT, have that conversation, have that thought, how is this going to impact my scope 1 and 2 emissions, right? But when it comes to your scope 3 emissions, a lot of people say, well, look, I can't control that. That's my supply chain, right? I can't do anything about my suppliers. You absolutely can. There's loads of suppliers that have green initiatives, that have sustainable reporting, and you have a lot more control over those suppliers than you think you have. Because as soon as everyone starts making the noise, how is this sustainable? How does it start helping me meet my ESG goals? And those kind of things, the more suppliers take notice and the more they realize that they're going to win business. But also you will win business from it, and you will be an optimist. Because if we said, look at some of the benefits from sustainability programs, and I'm not going to talk about the benefits to the environment here, I'm going to talk about the benefits to any organization from, you know, a sales or a talent perspective. If you just picked any of these 3 things and went into your CEO's office and said, are these 3 things important to you? They're not going to say, oh, no, we don't want to increase revenue. Nah, not interested in that this year. Oh, we don't want to attract and retain talent. No, I don't care about that. New products? Nah, I don't need any of them. Better value proposition? Nah, I don't want any of them. They're not going to say that. They're going to say, great. It's really going to help support some of that. And when Gartner benchmarks some of the key benefits from sustainability programs, you can see that it matches all of these. Some more than others, yes. But it absolutely makes an impact into how your business presents itself to the outside world, right? So if anyone sat in this room thinking, well, I don't really care about the environment, Chris, fair enough. Your business might care about the money it might make. So again, sustainability reporting. I'm going to bring it back to Microsoft. Microsoft have really good sustainability dashboards. As an example, Microsoft can tell you the exact CO2 impact of a single server. I can go into the Azure portal right now, turn a server on, leave it running for a week, look into it, and it will tell me exactly what the CO2 impact of that server is, right? That's a really good tool, and it really starts making me think about how I factor that into my scope 3 emissions. Make sustainable hardware decisions. There's so much embodied carbon in some tin or a laptop or switches or firewalls or networking equipment, so much carbon in it. Can you look to make purchasing decisions that actually reduces that impact and helps on that front? And fundamentally, when we talk about do more with less, again, it doesn't mean working harder or longer, but it just means stop wasting things. A lot of people can't realize where they are wasting things, and so they can't, address the problem accurately. They can't figure out where to focus their energies. If you look at how Bytes are helping, we can help you pick a sustainable portfolio. We can free up some of your resources to focus on what matters. We've got really good sustainability reporting. We've got a sustainability officer that does this all the time. It's their bread and butter. And if you ask us what our position is on this, what our reporting is on that, we'll be able to answer it. And that's it. That's all I've got to say. So hopefully, you can have a bit of optimism today in the fact that IT is one of the biggest carbon users of your organization, but there are things that you can do about it. You've got some steps to take away, and you realize that you can actually have an impact on these things, whether it's your scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions.